Hello, everyone. Welcome to the XX Factor, episode 3, the show where I and Christa go through and discuss the gender critical movement and show how it is or isn't like a conspiracy theory or a cult, or we talk about some of their ideas and their motivations. So anyway, my name is Katy Montgomerie, and I'm a dickhead who argues on the internet. And this is...
Christa Peterson. I'm a philosophy student.
And also a dickhead who argues on the internet. It's important to say that every week because, you know, new people, they might not know, they might think we're reasonable otherwise. So
what we were talking about the first week was the features broadly that make this like a conspiracy theory, just kind of the way it's informationally closed. There's this idea that trans people are secretly powerful and that there's this trans agenda and all this money fueling the movement. And then last week we went on to some of the more specific supposed motives for this conspiracy. In particular, we talked about money, the idea that this is a pharmaceutical, usually conspiracy to make all kinds of money, and then that this is somehow an anti-woman oppressive.
Yeah, two of the classic things. Part of lots of moral panics often focus on protecting women and children and where's the money coming from.
Yeah, and then this week I think we're going to talk about one of the biggest moral panics ones, which is the idea that there's some sexual motive here.
Yeah.
First, this may be like more unique to gender critical. So we see the idea that there's like an anti-gay conspiracy here, that somehow the trans movement is serving to oppress gay people.
Yeah, which is extra frustrating. Are you ready to move on to some slides and stuff?
Yeah, sure. Let's do.
Right, okay. So, everyone in the chat, let us know if you can hear us. I think that's quite important. Okay, so we're on to the first screenshot. Oh, I've got a little bit of rubbish at the top. Okay. So, can you see it?
Yes, this is the first one.
Cool.
Okay. So this is, we mentioned before, I think this Medium user pseudonym who has written one of the probably two most influential like follow the money expose pieces. This is another one of her Medium pieces, and it starts out, what if I told you there was a movement, nay, a civil rights movement to castrate children that may potentially turn out gay, homosexual, fruity, fabulous. I know you reply, that's unrealistic, horseshit, untrue, conspiracy theories. That is my reply. She says, you'll get even more incredulous when I tell you that this civil rights movement is doing so with an off-label chemo drug that has been subject to multiple lawsuits for off-label marketing because, well, duh. Leopards, spots, tired expressions, etc. Crazy, nuts. You probably believe the water is turning the frogs gay. Okay, what if I told you the civil rights movement to castrate children was a transgender rights movement? Did I pique your interest enough to keep going? Yes? Good? No? Well, I don't care. You should read this article anyway.
It's written in a really weird voicing. Like, I don't know, it feels like it's written like a storybook.
The children are being castrated, children that may potentially turn out gay, homosexual, fruity, fabulous. Yeah. Very odd tone.
I just want to make it clear that you can be castrated and fabulous at the same time. So
yeah, I find very striking about this idea that, like, what if I told you this? You'd think it was a huge conspiracy. But what if I told you it was trans people? Then it would be different.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think I guess the idea is to, I don't know, I try and give things written like this the benefit of the doubt. The idea is to write something crazy and then justify it belief. And, you know, maybe this person tries to justify it beneath. But to say it's a civil rights movement, I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter what type of movement it is, but this is a movement with the goal of castrating children in mind. This isn't like, oh, we're trying to, you know, do the best thing for trans kids and we're misguided or anything. It's literally just, our goal is to castrate children. Like, number one, it's just, transparently ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think like the specifics of what people think, what it's for varies. This idea that it's not a reasonable disagreement, that it's not. Sometimes they'll say like, of course, we need open debate. We need to be able to disagree about what the right thing to do is for trans adolescents. But then it very quickly becomes that they just take it to be obvious that this is against these children's, I mean, mostly adolescents is who they're talking about, but these young people's interests for them to receive trans healthcare. And
I always think it's very transparent when they do the "we need to debate, we need to talk" thing, because I mean, there's such a classic right wing and reactionary and like fascist strategy is to say, oh, we just want to talk, and then they just force their ideas out, and they don't want to talk, they don't want to have an argument. And if you start calling them out, they start, threatening you and suing you and trying to shut you down in the best they can. And they won't ever actually have these proper arguments, because there is a place to have a proper argument about trans healthcare, and that's within academia, between the experts on trans healthcare. That's where the debate in full should be happening, because they're the people who know how to help trans kids. But then when that happens, it comes out with a result they don't like. So then they have to present this like extreme, all the doctors have all got into this, for some reason, are all just really keen on the idea of castrating children. So they can't be normal, they must be monstrous, and it's all a big conspiracy. So
yeah, let's go to the next.
Yeah, we just lost the window. So, am I in the right place?
Let's do 3
though. Number 3.
It is linked to this one.
Did I start on the wrong one?
We started in the middle, but it's in order. So this on the left is just someone in the gender critical movement sharing this article, which was called "The New Homophobic Bridge to Nowhere: Child Transition." And this person says, I think the term sexual lobotomy might catch on. And then we see that this is shared by Kathleen Stock, who's my bellwether of the most mainstream parts of the gender critical movement. So she shares this and she says, any investigative journalists following me? Cough. So you see this kind of acceptance of these more extreme conspiracy theories, I think pretty dispersed throughout the movement.
So I guess this is kind of the focus of, maybe you've got other screenshots to show this, but like the focus of this section is pointing out something which I think a lot of my cis straight friends are completely unaware of. And it's this idea that trans people are trying to force gay people to transition to make them straight, I guess. So the idea is if it's a lesbian person, then rather than being a woman attracted to women, you pressure them to transition into a man who's attracted to women. And that's like part of the argument that they're trying to make here as to why transition is bad. And I guess this is what this is saying, like the new homophobic bridge to nowhere, child transition. They're trying to say all of these kids who would normally be gay are now transitioning instead of just being cis gay people. I mean, it's wrong, but I guess that's the idea that this part is discussing. Yeah,
right. And I think we've mentioned this before, but it's extreme enough to the point that they'll often just refer to young trans men as young lesbians.
Yeah.
I think they should be.
Yeah, it's worth noting that more trans people are, how's the best way to say this? Trans people are more likely to be gay or bisexual than they are to be straight after transition. So there are more trans men who are attracted to men and trans women who are attracted to women than trans women who are attracted to men and trans men who are attracted to women. So like, even if they are arguing that some lesbians are being tricked into transitioning, that clearly won't explain the majority of trans men, because the majority of trans men are either bisexual or gay after transition. So like it's very surface level, plainly false for the idea that it's the main cause. And like you say, they often will just talk about all trans men as if they're all would-be lesbians, when most of them aren't attracted to women or aren't just attracted to women.
You would also think that, from the way they sometimes talk, you would think that all trans men are like 17 years old.
Yes.
The fact that there are plenty of trans men who are adults is just kind of confused.
We kind of covered that a little bit in the first episode, like the difference between, and I think we're about to see that with the second part of this when we go into like the sexual motive, the massive contrast when they're talking about transition being homophobic. They are specifically talking about young lesbians. And when they talk about transition being about sex, they're mainly focusing on older trans women. And they just kind of ignore trans girls. And they, like when they're talking about this, I very rarely see anyone saying young boys who would be gay are being tricked to transition into girls. Like, just doesn't, despite it happening in roughly equal numbers.
Let's do one now, I think.
Okay. I'm so sorry I picked the wrong one to do first. Oh, you've got a 0, a 00, a 0.1 and a 1.
Now one. Okay, this is J.K. Rowling, who you may have heard of. She says, many health professionals are concerned that young people struggling with their mental health are being shunted towards hormones and surgery when this may not be in their best interests. Many, myself included, believe we are watching a new kind of conversion therapy for young gay people who are being set on a lifelong path of medicalization that may result in the loss of their fertility and or full sexual function. I think that she also counts as one of the most mainstream members of the movement. And this idea that it's a new kind of conversion therapy, I think, has become kind of prevalent.
I mean, from her, she's really spread that.
Yeah, Kathleen Zug also has a piece arguing this, but does not have the ratio.
Yeah. It's very frustrating, especially seeing as most gender critical people are opposing conversion therapy bans. I might even argue that's one of the main reasons we still have one, because our government, the Conservatives, even proposed a ban on conversion therapy, and they're dragging their heels probably because the gender critical movement has such a big influence. Because if you ask any trans rights activist, what do you think of conversion therapy for gay people and for trans people, they'll be aggressively against it because, lots of them have faced it. It's quite common, and people, everyone knows someone who's faced it. But then whenever you talk about conversion therapy to gender critical people, they pretend it doesn't really happen, or it can only happen to gay people, and then they explicitly want to push conversion therapy onto trans children, just openly, or they'll just rename it to gender critical therapy or reparative therapy or watch and wait therapy or something, which is all the same stuff. But it's just I just feel like it's so projection that all the trans people are saying, let's outlaw conversion therapy in every single form. And the gender criticals are saying, no, because we kind of want to do it.
Yeah. So I'm going to annoyingly read some from Kathleen Stock's The Article piece, which I almost put in the screenshots and then I didn't. But it's very relevant here.
Yeah.
But so this is from a piece called Stonewall's New Definition of Conversion Therapy Raises a Few Questions. And it starts off by saying that the concept of conversion therapy originally described any therapy attempting to change a homosexual same-sex orientation to a heterosexual one. She says it's reasonable. There's little convincing evidence that a homosexual orientation can be changed after late childhood. Second, homosexuality isn't harmful either to the individual or wider society. She says, in recent times, however, it's become accepted by many that there's a second possible type of conversion therapy, not just from gay to straight, but also from trans to non-trans. See Stonewall's own definition, which says, sorry, that's the time. Conversion therapy refers to any form of treatment or psychotherapy which aims to change a person's sexual orientation or to suppress a person's gender identity. This is a common move you see them make where they say, oh, originally conversion therapy was just about trying to convert people out of their sexual orientation, as though the idea that conversion therapy to make people stop being trans is like new. The idea that that counts as conversion therapy just happened yesterday. This is not true.
Yeah, it's so frustratingly mad for so many reasons. I mean, for a start, the arguments that she makes that once they reach adolescence, you don't grow out of being gay, and that conversion therapy doesn't work, they just apply to trans people too.
Straightforwardly, they straightforwardly apply.
There's just the same arguments with the same, like, we've got the evidence for it too. And then also there's this, like, yeah, you're saying like, oh, it's conversion therapy for trans people is new. I mean, it's not new. It's probably just as old as conversion therapy for gay people, but like as explicitly as a practice, obviously there's more focus on gay people because it's more prevalent, but also because we haven't had the words for trans people for as long. And lots of the time, trans people just were included as gay people, like particularly when the focus was on trans women as being like the main type of trans person, and there was less awareness of trans men. Often trans women were just considered gay men, regardless of their sexuality, and they would have that conversion therapied out of them too. Well, they wouldn't, but, you know, the same pressures would be applied. So often when they're talking about these terms, and like this also counts for like the like another thing which they try and like sweep away trans people in is like the Holocaust. When like in Weimar Republic Germany, trans people were like considered gay cross-dressers, and you had like a cross-dresser license, but you were like a gay person. So when they went and rounded up all the gay people, obviously that included trans people too. But then they didn't say gay and trans people because they just didn't really use the word for it. And then now they're saying, oh, it wasn't explicitly written down, so it didn't count. But then they'll themselves then go on to confuse trans and gay people, and they'll say, oh, all trans men are just gay women. It's like, well, make up your mind. Either say that they're different things or say they're the same, and either one doesn't back up your argument about conversion therapy. So very frustrating.
So then she goes on and notes that now many of them have disagreements about people thinking that trans women are lesbians. And she says, in this new paradigm, the gap between a gay or lesbian person and a trans person is paper thin, and it is entirely plausible that a therapeutic intervention might easily convert one to the other. So she's just kind of like intuited that this is plausible. And then she continues with this narrative of, imagine a 14-year-old biological female named Margie. She's becoming aware that she's sexually attracted to women, or at least to females like her. Simultaneously, she's developing dysphoria. She starts to tell people, I'm a boy. She asks, how should therapists respond? Current guidelines tell them to avoid both kinds of conversion therapy. But here's the rub. According to the terms set out by the new paradigm, you can't avoid both. If Margie's self-diagnosis, I'm a boy, is questioned by the therapist can be construed as failing to affirm, and so putatively converting a trans child to a cis one. If, on the other hand, Margie's self-diagnosis is affirmed unquestioningly, the therapist is effectively failing to affirm Margie in a sexual orientation of lesbianism, something which also looks like conversion by omission. This is so, there's a central, these things are not similar in that, like, what, if we look back at what she calls Stonewall's own definition, you see, conversion therapy refers to any form of treatment which aims to change a person's sexual orientation or suppress a person's gender identity. Any kind of therapy that aims at a specific outcome regarding someone's sexual orientation or gender identity is entirely different from any kind of therapy that does not aim at any particular outcome. This is just a transformative difference that they just dissolve completely.
Also, it's a word game because it's like she's going in and she's saying, or he or whatever, this hypothetical person is going in and say, I feel like I would be happier if I was a boy, and separately, I am attracted to women. And so we're saying, oh, okay, your sexual orientation is into women. We're not going to try and change that because that would be conversion therapy. And your gender identity is boy. So we're not going to try and change that. because that would be conversion therapy. So it's just straightforward. The only way you can work this is if you say that your sexual orientation isn't just who you're into, but it's who you're into, and based on who you are. So it's this kind of like, by transitioning, your sexual orientation changes. It doesn't. It just happens that in English, our words for sexual orientation, like particularly lesbian, means a woman who is into women, whereas you could just have a word for sexual orientation which just was into women, and obviously then it's not changing. Like, your sexual orientation doesn't change when you transition. I mean, for some people it can drift a little bit as part of growing up and going through puberty again, but like, if you were attracted to just men before transition, you're attracted to just men after transition, the fact that you've gone from being a man to a woman or the other way around your sexual orientation hasn't changed. So it's just a definition dance word game, really.
Yeah, I think this is important, right? Like, what people mean when they say it can't change is, first and foremost, like, who you are attracted to can't be changed. The labels we use, I mean, I think there's good reason, right, in a lot of contexts, for distinguishing lesbians from straight men, despite them being attracted to the same people. But the idea that you can't switch from being a lesbian to being a straight man in your life is just the idea that you can't change your own gender, right? It's not anything to do with the question of whether you can change sexual orientation. The labels, and like whether you fall under a different label here, is just a matter of changing your gender. And I think a definition dance is like the exact right way to explain it. You just see this, like, so she quotes a doctor from the Royal College of Psychiatrists that says, your sexuality and your gender identity are inherent, and there's no evidence base and no therapeutic treatment to change what is simply part of someone's nature. She just asserts this assumption is unfounded. Perhaps it gets a gloss of legitimacy from the fact that sexual orientation is like this. There's no prior underlying psychological story to give us the real fact about Margie's transness. And so I think you have this kind of thing underlying a lot of the belief that the people being transitioned are young lesbians. It's just conviction that's who they're attracted to is like a deep psychological fact. And then just this belief that there's no deep psychological fact underlying transness. So I think it's just this thing that...
Which is like, there's a claim there's no evidence for. I mean, there's so much evidence to show that sexuality or who you're attracted to, is largely nature. To say it's innate, I always say, people are born gay, and, all human behavior is a mix of nature and nurture to some degree, and sexuality is definitely mainly, or as much as it can be, nature, and it's not something you can talk someone out of. And we have loads of evidence for that. So I totally agree with her on that. And then to just disregard all of the evidence we have for trans people. I mean, there's less evidence in terms of studies and numbers of people because there are less trans people and it's been studied less. But there's still loads of evidence for it. There's loads of evidence to show that cis people who are forcibly transitioned develop gender dysphoria and really suffer, and evidence that trans people benefit from transition and suffer when they're denied healthcare. And it's very, like, quite easy to get a grasp of most people's gender identity, including people who deny they even have one because they're gender critical. Like, would you like to transition? If I paid for you to transition right now, would you do it? Or if you just woke up and it just happened, would you be cool with it? No, they wouldn't. They'd be horrified and they'd want to transition back. And then they'll go and claim that gender identity isn't fixed or, isn't also largely nature. And it's just a contradiction. They're not coming to those conclusions based on the evidence. They're saying them because they need them to be true.
Yeah, let's go to 00. No.
I'm enjoying the system. Oh gosh, that went wrong. Sorry, everyone. I accidentally put the on the wrong screen. Right. Ta-da!
So this is one of her pieces in The Economist, which is called "There Are Fundamental Differences Between Gay and Trans Identities." Sexual orientation is more stable and persistent, argues Kathleen Stock, a philosopher. And then she just goes on to say, sexual orientation, the sense in which sexual orientation is fundamental is that it's relatively stable and persistent. Meanwhile, is being trans an identity in that sense? If we take trans people to just be the group of people who call themselves trans people, then I think the answer is, for some trans people, yes, but not all of them. This is because for some of the people who call themselves trans, it's not true that it's a relatively stable and persistent state. Take the burgeoning numbers of adolescent girls that now self-declare as trans. One study from 2013 suggests that around 2/3 will detransition. The study that she's referring to, which many of them refer to in this way, there's like 4 of these studies, and they're all studies on children. They're not studies on adolescents. They're studies that children who are referred to gender clinics are generally, like in these studies, by the time they're adolescents, are not reporting gender dysphoria. But they are not studies about children who declare that they are trans. They're definitely not studies about adolescents, likelihood of adolescents who actually identify as trans and who transition. They're absolutely not studies about that. And everyone, Kenneth Zucker, who is one of the researchers who is, I'm trying to put this in a way that won't get Katy in trouble.
He's a sexologist who's discredited for dubious things.
The therapy he does with young children is aimed to prevent them from being trans and include. But even he thinks that there's just no evidence that once people are adolescents, that if they have a trans identity, that will change.
Yeah.
So even people that they often present him as supporting their position, which is about changing post-pubescent children's gender identities. That is not what he is doing.
I think this is a really important point for everyone watching to just take home, is that this is such a common and I would say fundamental sleight of hand that all gender critical people do all the time. J.K. Rowling did it in her essay. It's the difference between like really young children, prepubescent children who are like less than 10, and then children who are adolescents who are, like 10 to 16 or whatever, and then like young adults and teenagers, like these like 3 rough groups, and the point at which you move from one to the other changes on every person because puberty can happen at a different age for different people. But importantly, when they're talking about, like you're saying here, about children saying they're trans and not being trans, what they're actually talking about is children with like gender issues who are in the youngest group, who then, when they reach the next group, aren't having gender issues or aren't trans. They're not talking about the group that they actually diagnose and the one that they're talking about for sexuality. So when they say sexuality is something you don't grow out of, like she even said for adolescence, and it's true, like once you get to adolescence, your sexuality is probably the one you're going to have for the rest of your life. And it's exactly the same for trans people, but they try and do this sleight of hand where they mix all the groups up. And like J.K. Rowling said as well about how like the majority, according to one study, the majority, probably just read this piece and parroted it, the majority of, the majority of children detransition or whatever. And firstly, it's not detransition because they didn't transition in the first place. But secondly, they're talking about pre-pubescent children under the age of 9 or 10. But the children who are actually being diagnosed, the ones who it's important to focus on because they're the ones who need the treatment and they're the ones who are being diagnosed, they never grow out of it. And it's the same as sexuality. So I just think always be aware whenever you hear them talking about children detransitioning, desisting, which is like another thing, which is another sleight of hand where they try and mix in similar concepts. They're always doing this. They're always mixing up prepubescent and adolescent children into the same group. And that's how they push this ridiculous idea that most people grow out of being trans. And just one other thing, but while I'm ranting, she's saying here about how sexuality seems to be for the rest of your life, but for some trans people it's not. Like obviously focusing on this idea of kids who aren't sure and don't go on to be trans when they're prepubescent, but also most people will say they discovered their sexuality when they were a teenager and it's the one they have for the rest of life. You do meet some people who say their sexuality changed, like from straight to bisexual, from bisexual to gay, or something a little bit. It's rare, and most of them don't. But it does happen. And it's the same with trans people. Almost all trans people you meet knew at some point early in their life, and it's never changed. And then you meet the occasional person who says, oh, I feel like it's changed over time. So there's like, it's just another thing where, I mean, I don't have the numbers on those, but like the idea that just because some trans people might do this, that it suddenly means that it's totally different is just kind of made up.
Yeah, and I think
anyway, sorry, ranting.
Well, I think another thing that it's important to keep in mind with this is that even with young children, the important question is not if young children who will grow up to be gay and young children who will grow up to be trans can be conflated, right? The important question is whether they can be distinguished. And in all of these studies, right, they're all using criteria for older diagnoses, not ones that are used today. They also none of them are finding that there's nothing predictive of whether young children grow up to be trans. I think this 2013 one finds that one of the most predictive factors is whether the young children say that they are the other gender versus just, I suppose none of these, not only are these children not self-declaring as trans, they're not self-seeking to be at the clinic, right? Some of these children are like 6.
Yeah.
Actually, I read a paper where Ken Zucker claims that one of his 4-year-old patients asked her parents to take her to a therapist, which I found striking. For the most part, these are young children whose parents are seeking out gender-related treatment for them. And of that population, it seems like many of them grow up to be gay. That is not if people are looking at any interventions for these children, they're not medical, they're social. People like Zucker think that social transition increases the likelihood of being a trans adult, which is an outcome that he is trying to avoid. And so they think it's like a very serious, consequential decision like that, but nothing's medical, right? And so they take these results for very, very young children. If you look at Zucker's work, he's working with children that are like 4, 5, 6, 7. They're very small. And then they apply this for like 15-year-olds, right? 15-year-olds who are telling people what their identities are, who are seeking care for themselves and are self-advocating. And they just use it to...
it's just conflating the two groups. Yeah.
It's so very different.
It's so frustrating. Just worth pointing out here, because this is something that Transgender Trend also do, is where they'll say, I'm gender critical, I'm critical of gender stereotypes. However, I think social transition increases the chance of someone transitioning when they're prepubescent. Therefore, we want to ban social transition, which means banning them from wearing boys' or girls' clothes that aren't for their birth sex, and banning them from, playing with certain toys. And it ends up just being really strong enforcement of gender stereotypes. Just like that's the only option. Because if you say, for some kids, social transition is literally just going to be playing with the toys they want and changing the ending letter on their name or something. And like to stop that, you would have to stop them playing with the toys they want, stop them wearing the clothes they want. And it's just nonsense. It's not critical of gender, is it? It's enforcing gender. And it's conversion therapy.
Yes. It's aiming at a specific outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
I think maybe the next screenshot.
Oh gosh, which one is that? 0.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh.
So this is I blocked out their name because it's just a average person, not a main figure in the movement. This is a common, I'm and this is, I think, the way that it gets especially conspiratorial. So this person says, the thing is that now infertile young person would have probably grown up gay, but otherwise just fine had non-trans affirmative counseling and support been offered. Non-trans affirmative is a euphemism. Puberty blockers, too, can effectively sterilize kids and deaden sexual function. It's a eugenics project. And Peterson says, yes, it is. They're trying to stop the next generation.
I see this so much, comparing trans people to eugenics. I mean, like the classic is when Graham Linehan went on national British TV and said that the doctors helping trans kids were the same as the Nazis because it was eugenics. That's just mad, like absolutely crazy. I feel like I could just miss all of this just by saying it's crazy, but like it's worth explaining why, I guess. But I don't know. It's hard to explain why it's so plainly rubbish. The idea that there are these doctors who they've got all this evidence to show that once kids get to adolescence, that transition benefits them and they suffer if they don't transition, and they've made all that evidence up because they want to castrate 0.3% of children over the age of 13 for some reason. But like, and they would have all grown up to be gay despite the fact that there's no evidence for that. And then what? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I also want to highlight this move that that now infertile young person would have grown up gay but otherwise fine. In the Kathleen Stuck pieces, you see her saying like, there's no reason to attempt anti-gay conversion therapy because being gay isn't harmful for the individual. With the heavy suggestion there that being trans is. This is like, these kinds of exact parallels to these arguments were used to justify anti-gay conversion therapy. Notably, HIV was a very serious medical issue for people and was a central argument that people used that being gay put kids at like great medical risk. And so because of that, it was justified and in their interest to try to convert them. And I mean, you still see this from groups, right? That it's like psychologically unhealthy to be gay. And this is not, it's just in fact not an argument that is that specifically distinguishes between these kinds of things. It's used for both.
I mean, look at the wording on that one. They would have grown up gay, but otherwise fine. Like, you're fine if you are gay. Like, there's not otherwise fine. They would have grown up to be gay and fine. I think this is another bit of projection they do. They often talk about this concept of the parents who would rather a straight kid than a gay kid. And so for some reason, rather than going to conversion therapy, which all of these homophobes instantly do, they go and try and force them to transition because in their mind, like that transition kid's sexuality then changes. So they'll say this thing like, oh, they would rather a straight trans kid than a gay cis kid. And it's so projection because it's literally exactly what they say. They're not saying, oh, I want a gay child specifically. They're just saying, oh, well, I'd rather a gay child than a trans child. Like, I don't want a gay child either, but it's better than a trans kid. And they go straight to conversion therapy. Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that like even these big groups like LGBT Alliance often talk about how kids can't know their sexuality, even adolescents. And they always say, oh, we shouldn't have LGBT clubs in school. We shouldn't politicize children by saying they can be LGBT. Like, stop pushing adult labels onto children. It's like they're trying to do this conflation again between a 4-year-old who maybe we shouldn't be saying is gay or straight because 4-year-olds don't some people do know when they're really young, but when we're talking about kids who know their sexuality, we're talking about 15-year-olds, not 4-year-olds. And it's the same with trans people. And it always comes with this kind of, hopefully if we don't talk about it and we offer conversion therapy, then it will go away kind of attitude. So yeah, it's very common between homophobia and transphobia here.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that this kind of pervasive idea that other than them, other than the enlightened people in the gender critical movement, that people pervasively would prefer to have a trans child than a gay child. This is false. It's just not true that in general trans people are more accepted than gay people.
In absolutely no respect. They like to point. First of all, I'll just say, like, I would bet that every single trans person watching this, at least once, probably many times, had someone say, "Can't you just be gay?" Like, I had that from so many people who went on to accept me, but at the first, like, it's kind of lots of people's first reaction. It's very common, and like, gay people still have a way to go to reach equality in both of our countries, but have some legal equality now in lots of senses. And trans people are still fighting for legal equality and are so far off social acceptance. It's just such a ridiculous claim that it's just another thing that should just be surface level. People should be like, wait, are you claiming that people would rather a trans kid than a cis gay kid? Like, what? When I first heard that, I was like, what? Do you have any idea what it's like to be either of those two things? Yeah.
Go to, what did I call this one? I think the next one.
Is that number 4?
0.1, no.
Sorry, a 1? 0.1, oh. Sorry, I did start in the middle, so I messed up your system.
Okay, so this is from one of the central outputs of Transgender Trend, which is one of the prominent organizations, like we said before.
They're the one who's raised the most money by a crowdfunder.
They were allowed to intervene in the Curabell court case. So one of their main outputs is this these materials for schools, advising them to take a gender critical approach to their trans students. But the materials include the statement by the Lesbian Rights Alliance, which says in the second section titled, "Tomboys Not Allowed, the Erasure of Young Lesbians in Schools." Only a few years ago, young girls were allowed to be tomboys, have short hair, wear trousers, and undertake games and activities, which traditionally have been considered the domain of boys. Many of these young girls defined as lesbians when they reached adolescence. This is no longer allowed. Transgender training is given to schools telling teachers that these girls are experiencing gender confusion and should be assisted or supported to self-identify as boys. Adolescent young lesbians in schools who do not want to conform to feminine stereotypes, sometimes also labeled as butch, are being bullied, stigmatized, isolated, and pressured to socially transition, since being a trans boy is now regarded as a more positive and fashionable identity.
There's so much here. My goodness, this is. I've not read this one. This is so bad. My God. God, I don't know where to start. Like, firstly, that's completely ridiculous. The idea that people are being pressured into being trans, like, just plainly rubbish. One thing that I will agree with them on here is that I think a lot of cis gay people will have heard, "Oh, why don't you just be a girl then? Why don't you just be a boy then?" Like, from homophobic people, because they've got this idea that sexuality and who you are is tied up in the same thing. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of gay people have experienced that, from idiots. But the idea that there's this like pressure to get gay people to transition from like progressive allies of LGBT people is just utterly mad.
Yeah, right. Like I think this point you said is important. Where like lesbians have long been homophobically called men.
Yeah.
This is not something new. This is not something trans people invented. And what people who do that are saying is not you should transition. Right?
Yeah.
They're
insulting you.
And they're saying you should be feminine. It's not like transition.
You should be straight is what they're saying. Yeah.
Yes. You should be straight, you should be feminine. And the idea that teachers, the schools are this source where teachers are assisting young lesbians to self-identify as boys. It's just such a loaded phrase, right? There's guidance encouraging teachers to support students, however they identify. But this kind of insidious idea that they are being told that they should diagnose these girls, the group that they call young lesbians.
Yeah.
That teachers should be the ones who should be like, oh, this person is experiencing gender confusion and needs to be assisted to self-identify as a boy.
Like being assisted to self-identify is a completely ridiculous concept. Like if they can find something where schools are saying you need to help people who haven't come up to you and said what their identity is in order to get the identity, then yeah, I'll call it out. But they always try and twist this like, oh, if a kid comes up and says they're trans, you should accept them, into you should go around looking for people and tell them they're trans, which is just completely different concepts and are obviously one of them's good and one of them's bad. And they just try and mix them up. Also, this thing about how tomboys are no longer allowed. Like, what are you on about? They often try and push this idea that being trans is just gender stereotypes, which just plainly contradicts everything that you can get from talking to trans people. It's not about gender stereotypes. You get tomboys, tomboy like women and tomboy girls who are trans girls. And you can get feminine trans men and trans boys. It's just rubbish. It's just garbage. I would estimate that as a percentage, there is a greater percentage of tomboy trans women than there are tomboy cis women. That's what I would guess.
And it's a double bind, right? If you are a super feminine trans woman, you're like the exemplar of how stereotype fueled this is. And if you're a tomboyish trans woman, then it's just proof that you're not really a woman, right?
Yeah, you're not trying hard enough.
Posting photos of you to illustrate that
you're not really a woman. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely standard strategy from all gender critical people all the time. Even the most like ones who try and present themselves reasonable is to post pictures of tomboy trans women and say, look, it's a man, which is just exactly what all the homophobes do with tomboy cis women and say, look, it's a man. You should be more feminine. It creates the same pressures. God, transgender trend is evil. Like, such a disgusting organization.
Yeah.
It's like one thing that I do gain from reading this is it just feels crazy to me. Like, if you're already opposing trans people or stuff, you would love this. But I just think that people who have no idea would read this and just be like, no, this is from a crazy hate group. Like, it just doesn't come across as sane to me. But
yeah, I also hope that, but I believe for these materials, they were shortlisted for the John Maddox Prize, which is a prize to recognize people who promote science and evidence in fraught situations. And I was hoping that it was like fake, but it's actually like supported by Nature, like one of the biggest.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
It's just
what evidence? Read it. It's mad.
Yeah.
Oh God. I think a lot of these things must be some academic who is transphobic, some gender critical person tells their friend who works there and they're like, oh, you should put these guys on. And they're like, yeah, okay, we'll shortlist them for this prize. But I don't know, that's what I hope anyway, because no one can be seriously looking at this and being like, oh, look at the evidence that they've provided here.
Yeah, they have just been, as a movement, wildly successful at getting mainstream, prestigious.
No social movement has achieved so much in such a short amount of time.
So except that they are like the voice of science and reason. This is just such a thin facade. Right? If you just look at all at what they're referencing, like Kathleen Stock is an academic, right? She should be able to do basic research on this stuff. And if you try to check the empirical work that she's citing in her pieces that are published in major outlets like The Economist, it is just so wrong. And it's just not a competent analysis of the literature at all. And if you look into this stuff at all, you see it's everywhere. It's just everywhere.
Yeah.
And
it's all built. I think this is how they've done it so well, is that because lots of the media outlets are so bullshit for trans people, like The Economist is terrible. The Economist will publish really grim stuff. The Economist published a thing a while ago saying, should trans people be sterilized before they get rights? Like, they tweeted that out at some article. Like, imagine, it's so extreme, but what they can do is they can build all these articles on top of each other's articles, because they've been at this for years and they've had like 2 or 3 a week. They can say, oh, as this person said, oh, as this person said. But then when you follow it back to the actual studies, it's not holding up. But it holds up if you only ever go as far as articles written in The Economist and The Times and The Guardian and stuff.
It's grim.
It's pretty grim. Do you want to move on to the other folder?
I don't know. We have 10 minutes left, which I feel like...
Oh, no. Perhaps we should talk more about this children conspiracy then.
Yeah, let's do that.
We're covering less ground every week. Yeah, I find it very frustrating when... so I guess another thing that comes in with this, and is this the one that mentioned it? Where they say that since being trans is now regarded as a more positive and fashionable identity than presumably being a cis gay person, still suggesting kind of that being gay is a fashionable identity or positive identity. It's not, it's neutral and it's not fashionable because it's not a fashion. It's something that you're just born, same as being trans. But this kind of ties into one of their main things that helps them force this through, which is this ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is this thing that they've made up. And I feel like I mean, it's worth searching YouTube if you don't know much about rapid onset gender dysphoria and read it, watching some takedown videos or reading the study yourself. Like, just go and read it because it is so bad. It's some researcher who went on some websites about these trans parents who have trans kids who want to force them food conversion therapy, and they'd come up with this term of rapid onset gender dysphoria to explain it, and it's like a social contagion, and that's kind of one of their main like conspiracy theories around this, that being trans is just a fashionable thing that people are copying from each other. Sorry, there's so much cat hair in the room now. Poppy just got off and it's like all sticking to my face. But the idea that, being trans is this cool thing that everyone sees and they all want to be. And like, it's just topsy-turvy land. The idea that people think trans people are cool, or that people pressure people into being trans, or that you're not allowed to be a cis person anymore. Like, it's just utterly mad. And it's the same attitude that you always see from reactionary movements. Like, oh, you can't even say you're British anymore. Like, it's that same attitude where as soon as a minority gets even an ounce of respect, the reactionaries all pretend like, being a minority is the only way to go. It's just so frustrating. Such garbage.
Yeah. So the study that Katy is talking about, just to give a little overview. So the researcher recruited parents on websites like Transgender Trend. So essentially on websites for trans skeptical parents.
Who aren't skeptical, just to be clear.
And then found that these parents reported that there was like no indicators that their child was trans, and then it just came on all of a sudden. And there's like social media and stuff like that. But the population of parents that she drew from is the population discrediting children's identities.
Yeah.
And
it's literally like saying, I have evidence of UFOs because I went to IBelieveInUFOs.com on the forum and I asked people if they'd seen a UFO, and then they had. And so that's the evidence. And like, it's literally that flimsy. She comes up with this idea that rapid onset gender dysphoria exists because she's gone to a forum for people who already believe in that and didn't talk to any children, didn't talk to any experts. Like there's even a bit where in the paper where she cites a hyperlink from Reddit to say about how kids are being tricked into it by social media. And because of how Reddit URLs work, she's sorted by most downvoted. So it's like Reddit, transgender, ask transgender people, whatever, sort by most downvoted. And it's like one of the most downvoted posts because it's someone saying like, I didn't used to think I was trans and now 5 minutes later I think being trans is really cool. Did you also have this? Or something like that. And it's like evidence that rapid onset gender dysphoria exists. It's just such a mad thing. And also, like fundamentally, when you come out to someone, for a lot of people, coming out is some kind of reveal and some kind of surprise. So it's going to seem rapid onset to the person who's learning about it. Like I came out at 25 and lots of people in my life were not expecting that because, you know, people go a long way to hide in the closet when they're growing up. And it wouldn't really be coming out if it wasn't rapid. Like it's kind of, you know, it's kind of like part of coming out is that it's a rapid realization to people. So if you only ask the people that you've come out to, they'll all say, oh yeah, it came out of nowhere. It's just like the definition of coming out. It's just so stupid.
Yeah, I find reading the way parents talk about their children, I just find so disturbing.
It's horrible.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, and like very different thing. But like I was diagnosed with ADHD very late in my life, and my parents like had no idea. I was having like severe ADHD all the time because parents just do not know everything about their children, and then there's just this pervasive idea that they do, right? And that parents have this special kind of insight and entitlement to control their children that is like pervasive in the movement. And
I just because I saw this yesterday on YouTube as like an episode of this comedy show from the UK, and there was a lady comedian on there who had epilepsy, and she got diagnosed with epilepsy at 15, but the doctors were like, oh, you probably had it from age 10 and just no one noticed. And she'd been having these like seizures, just short ones, for like 5 years of her life, and her parents hadn't noticed. So, you know, that kind of thing can happen. But you know, my parents weren't expecting me to come out as trans. It's just a common thing. Like so many LGBT people, like across the whole range of LGBT people, their parents didn't know. And I've met, you know, adult gay and lesbian people too, whose parents still don't know. Yeah, it's just ugh. And so something you mentioned earlier is about how they are always talking about trans men as if they're lesbian children. And like I've met you get these ROGD parents types on Twitter and social media and stuff, and they're always really grim people. Because they're these people who are seeking out conversion therapy, but often they're talking about their child as if they're like a baby. And then you find out they're 24 and they moved out 6 years ago because of abusive parents. Like there's a couple of people like usually the dads are the worst, rapid onset gender dysphoria dad or whatever, who are like, they're talking about, oh, my daughter was stolen from me. And it's like, your daughter who was stolen from you, your young little princess, is like a 25-year-old man who is married and like doesn't live in the same state as you anymore because you're so abusive, because you're stuck in this crazy world where your adult man son is like this princess who's 7 years old or something. And yeah, they just cannot drop it. And that's where you see this kind of push to ban trans healthcare up to the age of 25, because they just cannot drop the idea that their kids have grown up. It's very weird, very grim. The whole thing's so disturbing when you encounter them. How they talk about their children is just vile. Especially when they're actively campaigning against their own children's rights. It's like, your daughter who, by the way, transitioned 6 years ago and has had like genital surgery and now has a boyfriend and stuff. Your daughter, who relies on trans healthcare, trans protections to live, you're campaigning against them.
Clock.
You're like campaigning against your daughter's own freedom. Like, I've encountered people like that. It's just, ugh. It's just so disgusting. Sorry, I'm ranting.
Yeah, no, I think there's this pervasive sense that there's this mysterious phenomenon. So all these young people transitioning that has emerged out of nowhere and needs some dramatic explanation. And maybe like the least conspiratorial explanation is that they've all gotten together on Tumblr and convinced themselves because it doesn't require a conspiracy and it's like overarching. But it still is like a really odd theory, right? And then you just quickly do get into these other conspiracy theories that are, and it might, the Tumblr idea is like also pervasive. I think you just see a lot of coexistence of all of these supposed motives, right? Where it's like, it's on Tumblr, but then sometimes you see like, people will be like, oh, I wonder now how many of the people on Tumblr were actually adult men. So I assume they mean trans women, but the idea that they're really feeding it to
there's this argument, I think it's called like the kettle strategy or something, and like the idea is that someone they borrowed your kettle and they return it and it's damaged, and you say you've damaged my kettle, and they say no, the kettle isn't damaged and I never borrowed it in the first place. And so they're like, what? Their arguments can't coexist. They're sort of like, oh, I didn't give your kettle back. I didn't borrow it in the first place. I don't even like tea. Like, I didn't damage the kettle. It's not damaged. Look at it. Like, when I gave it back to you, it was fine. And they're all these contradictory arguments. But each one on their own could be an argument against it. Like, say, oh, when I handed you the kettle, it wasn't damaged. And also, I never borrowed it. Like, if one of those two are true, then it's fine and it's not your fault. But the fact is that they can't coexist. But for someone who's just looking for an excuse to not believe the conclusion, they'll just chuck them all out. They'll be like, oh, kids are being tricked into it by older trans women, and also they learnt about it on Tumblr, and also their teachers are forcing them into it, and and also it's rapid onset gender dysphoria from their friends, and also it's because they're playing with the wrong type of toys, and also it's like all of these things can't coexist. But they just chuck them all out because one of them just needs to stick. So we've got some questions. If anyone would like to ask some questions, please tag me in so I can see and it highlights it. Did you have anything else to add before we move on to questions?
No, but so next week, we're going to have to postpone the sexual conspiracy because I'm desperate to talk about this. So next week, we're going to talk about the connection between David Icke, who thinks that the Queen is a lizard woman, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion are real, and the mainstream gender critical movement.
Yeah, so when Christa presented, like as soon as someone brings up David Icke or the lizard people, or like, it's like flat earth, isn't it? It's like saying, oh, gender critical is like flat earth. And it kind of sounds a bit crazy because it's just kind of so extreme. Like, who the hell believes in lizard people? Some people do, but surely not the gender critical people. But they're like 2 steps away. There's a lizard person, and there's someone who really believes him, and then there's all the mainstream gender critical people who will believe this middle person. So I think it's when next week is when it gets really spicy and really like off the wall, because like even some of the stuff this week that I talked about yesterday in Turf Wars about how the idea of this like crazy transhumanist immortality body demonization project, like that's the big names who we've been discussing this whole series are like at least receptive to these crazy things. So next week's going to be good. We're going to introduce you to some very interesting people who aren't so prominent, and they're just all of the prominent people talk about them and clearly read all of their stuff. So yeah. Anyway, so let's do some questions. So the first, suddenly jumped. The first one is from Jay Burton. What effect has lockdown had on potentially accelerating gender critical exposure and views?
Yes. Okay. When this all started, I very, very stupidly was like, maybe now that there are so many immediately pressing real issues in the world, they will talk about something else and will focus on the real things. Incorrect. That was wrong.
Very wrong.
It's very worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's made all conspiracy theories worse. Like QAnon's really picked up in lockdown. So many people just believe in some kind of conspiracy rubbish like 5G and coronavirus is fake, and like all of Trump really did win the election. And I guess it's because people are trapped inside, not talking to normal people, and they can just be in their little echo chamber communities for a much longer sections of the day, and so it gets more reinforced. Because like normally you would be like, oh, did you know that the people who orchestrated the trans rights movement were 4 Jewish billionaires? And then you go and say that at the pub and someone would be like, what? But if you just say that to your little cult on Mumsnet, then they're all like, oh, tell me more, I'm going to post you a link. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope we soon get to talk about the cult aspect, because part of it here, I think that especially has been accelerated in lockdown, is the extent to which the movement provides like a community for people, and by joining this movement online, people are able to get a sense of inclusion
And purpose.
And the sense in which that the movement kind of recruits people who are kind of putting feelers out and having a bad time about kind of whatever then is getting funneled into being about this very nebulous trans rights stuff. And there's just a ton of people who are waiting to affirm you on that and who are very eager to support you if you put your problems in this one specific guise. And yeah, it's just gotten worse. And
I mean, it is really terrible, the amount of people who are getting sucked into this like culty conspiracy theory of gender critical, and personally it's very bad for me. But sometimes I do think, well, at least they're not like falling down the outright pipeline, or at least they're not falling down the QAnon one, because like it's gender critical is horrible and it's ruining people's lives today, thousands of people's lives. But it's not QAnon, is it? Like maybe it could be worse, but maybe they'll merge. Like who knows?
It's not QAnon yet, right? And plenty of the people in it will not ever get to anything that explicitly just off the wall. But it'll be very surprising if it's not a gateway for many people.
Yeah, for sure. Because often people just get more extreme.
Yeah,
especially when lockdown ends and like, then what?
And you see just pretty straightforward parallels between the way the gender critical movement thinks about issues and the way people on the alt-right do, which alt-right people have noticed and are interested in furthering these things where like this central issue on the gender critical side is like whether it's true that trans women have high crime rates, and if they do have high crime rates, then we should exclude them from certain public spaces. And like in real decent life, we do not exclude people from public goods because they belong to demographic groups with higher crime rates. That is very alt-right. The alt-right has noticed, and there's some articles that were written about people like who have followed this pipeline where they started off thinking like, oh, it's male crime. Males are the problem. And then they start looking more statistically like, it's not just males, it's non-white males. And it just is
exactly. One step away.
Yeah, I guess I'll say that people are like a little more resistant to it than I thought that they might be, given how directly parallel the kind of reasoning is. And you will see pushback in the gender critical movement from people who start saying racist things, but it's scary. It just seems like it's waiting.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It's Anyway, let's pick another question. These arguments completely ignore NBs or non-binary people. Do you think this is because they do not believe the identity of NBs or because it undermines the gay conversion argument? I think it's just because they don't believe non-binary people exist. I don't think there's an undermining of gay conversion therapy really there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the existence of non-binary people is problematic for a lot of their stuff, right? I mean, the idea that trans people are rigidifying gender binaries, like when the actual TERFs were making this argument in the 70s, when trans people were like really heavily by doctors and needed to kind of exemplify stereotypes in order to get
treatment. Yeah. Which still happens today, but not as bad.
But what you have seen is that the predictions that trans people were rigidifying gender boundaries have demonstrably turned out to be completely false. If we look at trans people today, many people are non-binary. So this prediction, false.
It's like a third of trans people.
But yeah, this is where you especially see the kind of thing that you saw in the transgender trends and lesbian thing, where like the idea that this is a fashionable identity comes out in this kind of like bitter, weird stuff that kids do in high school, where they're like, "Oh, you're just doing this to be cool." And so they do it all the time. Where it's like, "Oh, non-binary, call it non-binary women, maybe non-binary females, where it's assigned female people who are non-binary. Oh, they just think that they're so special and different, but all women are non-binary, and they just have a big head." I think part of it is thinking that they're not real.
When like, in a way, binary trans people are closer to acceptance than non-binary people. There's loads of different aspects, and all transphobia affects all different groups differently. But I find when I post something about trans women and like, I'm a trans woman, here's a picture of me, and it like trends, and there's a hashtag and I get like 5,000 likes or something, I always get some abuse from gender critical people and from just random shitheads. I always get some, but that, that's normal, and I quite enjoy baiting them. But if I post something about non-binary people, like, the abuse is a lot more of it and a lot more extreme. And like, I don't want to sort of scare any non-binary people who haven't come out in the audience. You can block these shit people, and there are great places for trans people to hang out and all this kind of stuff. But, and also I have a huge platform, and so I always get abuse. But like, I just think non-binary people are even less accepted. And the idea that they're doing it to be cool, like, what are you talking about? Like, it'd be so much easier and cooler and more accepted by society to be a cis person. And if you can't do that, it'd be so much easier to be binary trans person, because then your own government will recognize your identity. Like, the doctors are going to actually give you treatment. Like, lots of your friends will respect you more. It's such a bullshit argument. It's just surface level bullshit.
Super infantilizing, right? It's like, if we think that they act like every trans man is 17, they act like every non-binary person is like 15, right? It's as though this is exclusively a group of very young people. And I just want to say about the 70s. So in the 70s, like, there were clearly also like gender non-conforming trans women, right? A central thing that made all of the TERFs mad was Sandy Stone, who was a radical feminist lesbian trans woman. So it's not like there was no one like this. I just think it has this kind of prediction that this was going to result in rigidifying is now just like so obviously false, and it's just like empirically cannot be supported anymore.
Just again, on Sandy Stone, this is something I was going to put in Turf Wars, but I haven't had time for it yet. But like, like you say, she was a radical feminist lesbian trans woman, and they threatened to kill her so much. Like, people with guns turned up to her talks to intimidate her and stuff. Like, radical feminists, it was extreme. So the idea that like trans people are the ones doing death threats exclusively is nonsense. Anyway, so I think it's a kind of an interesting point. So this is from an Entropy fan who says, let's assume social contagion bullshit is true. Wouldn't for every peer pressured, fake, misled trans person, there'd be like 100 fake cis people. Most influential figures are cis, not trans. Yeah, like if you could trick people into being one or the other, most people are cis, most famous people, all the rich people, all the powerful people, everyone is cis. Why would anyone think the trans people are cool? Yeah?
This is a kind of a weird feature in this kind of Zucker article I was reading this morning. He says like most young children's gender identities are stable, in particular cis children's. And yeah, I mean, you would think that if like every young gender nonconforming child receives constant conversion therapy from society, like there is a great deal of, it's not like people aren't sufficiently pressured not to be trans, or so many people aren't sufficiently pressured to conform to gender roles. That is the whole thing. And this is a problem, like a big problem for the idea that people just need like a little push to not be trans, and they just need a therapist that's like, maybe you really are a woman and you're wrong. There's the world to do that. And
yeah, there are like 10 countries that have the death penalty for being trans, and they still all have trans people. So, like, just ridiculous. Again, straightforwardly false. Yeah, sometimes I think it is useful just accepting a few of their premises and just following them through and seeing how ridiculous they are. Like, what if being trans was just a trendy thing? Then, like, are people all going to suddenly grow out of it? Like, let's see. So they've been saying this for a long time. They've been saying this since the 90s when they first started treating trans kids. They're like, oh, all of the trans kids are going to detransition. And like lots of those kids who transitioned as adolescents, not as prepubescents, as adolescents, are older than me. They were like in their mid-30s or whatever. When are they going to detransition? When is this big reckoning coming? Because it hasn't happened yet. And
very soon.
yeah, and this is something that I know that on Gremlin Hands podcast, him and like his little crew, they were predicting that there would be a point soon where 50% of all people who are transitioned would detransition or more. They were like, that's when we know we've like beaten the trans menace or whatever, when 50% have detransitioned. It's like, mate, at the moment, it's like 0.5%. So you got a little way to go. And it's been about 0.5% for like longer than I've been alive. So when is this going to happen?
Supposedly imminently, like with most conspiracy theories, right? I think like it's always just that
doomsday's coming.
And yeah, they're all going to be proven right ASAP.
Okay, we've still got a bit of time. So from secular rarity says, I've heard older individuals that have said the narrative trans people are trying to erase gay/lesbian people by forced transition. Where does this come from? Is it just fear, or is there some obvious historical event I'm missing? Yeah, I guess we kind of a little bit addressed this earlier. I think that there is, like, when it comes from the majority of gender critical people, they're just using gay people as a tool. They do not give a shit about gay people's rights. Most of them are homophobic. They were the people who are opposing gay marriage just 10 years ago. And they've just realised that they can do the same. Oh, what about women? Like false fear-mongering. And they can just do, oh, what about gay people? And it's just like another tool in their like tool belt. But for some of the gender critical people who are gay themselves, they might have, like we were saying, experienced homophobia, saying, oh, why don't you just be a man, or why don't you just be a woman? And perhaps if they haven't ever met a trans person, they might draw that conclusion, and they might be very keen to jump to that conclusion if they themselves are transphobic or don't like the idea of trans people or whatever. But no, I don't think there's any big historical event that makes sense.
Yeah, I think like the biggest thing for a decent number of the straight gender critical people also I think are latching onto this, and I think it's just like they start off with this 100% conviction that the official explanation for why people are transitioning cannot be true. That is just a hard line ruled out. And so then there has to be some other explanation. And they just kind of will accept many of them at different points. I think it's not always exactly like a normal belief, like something stable over time that they definitely believe is true so much as they will say often. And like, it's not like they think that they're lying. It's just kind of like, I don't know. I think the way you think when you have this kind of like strange, this conviction and then need some explanation for it is just kind of different from the way people think normally. But yeah.
Yeah, it's all post hoc building up. Like you come up with a conclusion and then you build the premises after the fact. Edward K says, not to question, but thanks a lot for talking about trans male stuff because often it seems as if we're treated as we're invisible. Yeah, I know. Trans women get all of the like hype because the idea of a man giving up being a man is like, whoa, this is like crazy. And also sex sells and trans women are like just sex objects to a lot of people. Yeah, and also they have a harder time passing, I guess, on average. So they stand out more. Yes. Anyway, you're welcome.
I feel guilty about this sometimes because I read so much. I read and respond to a lot of just like the things they say very directly instead of. I think it's important to take a step back because often what they're doing is just, like you said, like just erasing trans men and making them not exist, and it's like the engine of a lot of their stuff.
Yeah, it ties into what we've talked about before on previous episodes about how trans men and trans women are treated very differently, and when you kind of look at that, the eye through the the idea of the patriarchy treating men and women very differently and how they see trans men and women, it very obviously makes sense as to why they don't care about older trans men and why they don't care about younger trans girls. I'm skipping past a few questions that people have asked where we've answered them in previous episodes. Sorry if I've missed your question out. Go and watch the previous episodes and we might have answered it. So this is from Luca to Horst, who says, how do you think the gender critical movement sometimes succeeds while their arguments don't make sense, aren't based on modern science, and are just overall rubbish? Yeah, it's quite frustrating. They have like the status quo and the establishment, I guess. They've got the media. There are loads of like transphobia. I know it kind of sounds just like pointing at something and saying transphobia, but it's a really powerful force. Society is very transphobic, and it was a lot worse just very recently. There are so many people who have grown up just thinking trans people are like crazy, mentally ill, sexual pervert losers. And then when you say like, oh, they want rights now, you're just like, ugh, no. And that's a strong argument for a lot of people. You can say, well, actually, the science shows this and actually this, but they've just got this visceral disgust because they've been taught that growing up. And that wins a lot of people. Like, and then you find out there's this movement that's fairly polished and legitimate looking, which is claiming to be speaking for women and is claiming to be pushing science. And they're backing up your irrational prejudice. Like, yeah, I'm going to support these guys without putting any effort into looking about what they're saying because they're saying what I want to be said.
Yeah, is it too pessimistic to say that like it's not just sometimes success, but it's like mostly success? Yeah, I mean, I'm focused on academia as an academic, but part of what I see is like kind of transphobia that is especially finding it natural to think that trans people are just being unreasonable and demanding and just don't understand. And I think that really has put an engine behind these anti-trans academics who are adding, I think, this important veneer of respectability that has enabled the movement to, I think, really gain traction in the media in academia at this point. And then I think an important part of this also has been just because you have the gender critical movement is smaller than it looks, but super pervasive is this sense that it's plausible. Even if people don't fully buy in, they think trans people are being unreasonable. And this has been helped along by, in terms of people's sense of what reality is, what the actual evidence is. I think cis academics sitting on their ass and just letting their cis peers get away with just massively misrepresenting stuff has made a big difference. And what people are seeing is that you have Alice Sullivan is a data expert who has been fear-mongering about the census losing data on sex, and this is just straightforwardly false.
But transparently false.
Yeah, she gets letters and stuff behind it, and other academics who aren't themselves trans, so trans academics speak about it and are dismissed on the grounds that oh no, we're just more unreasonable trans people. And then cis academics just don't do anything. They just are content to let these people represent themselves as the data experts who are talking about this and say stuff that's obviously false. And you have this small movement who have people that are in informationally prestigious roles like academia, and then all of these academics who we don't necessarily agree with all the end conclusions, but find it plausible enough that trans people are being unreasonable, making unreasonable demands, and aren't even looking for a second like they need to see that their discipline is being used to promote lies and hate. And it just...
Yeah, I find that most people, of all people in the world, don't care about trans issues. And that's the same with everything. Most people don't care about race issues because they don't affect them. And most people don't care about, feminist issues because it doesn't affect, if it doesn't affect you and it doesn't affect someone you love, you don't care. And I don't really hold that against people too much. There's that famous Martin Luther King quote about the biggest obstacle to black rights in America was not the racist, but the average white person who just doesn't care. And it's kind of true. But in one sense, at least they're not transphobic dickheads going the other way. But most people don't care. But then most of the people who do care are either trans people or these dedicated gender critical people. And they have more institutional power because trans people are up against, centuries of transphobia, keeping them out of everything: jobs, education, housing, healthcare. And so we don't have all of these. We don't have politicians who are trans people. We don't have all these professors who are trans people because it's just not been possible for trans people to do. So of the people who do care and who have the power to do something, most of them are gender critical. And then most people don't care. So when a gender critical person says, oh, I've made up this bullshit about the census, which is trivially false the second you take 1 second to look at it, most people don't care. So they're like, yeah, okay, cool. You're the expert. You care. If you care, then it's probably fine. And there's no opposition. So that's how they get it through.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to be just kind of any random person who says doesn't really care. But then if you are a data expert and you see these people doing this, you are involved here. You are involved in virtue of these people purporting to represent your discipline. Last week, someone asked me how I got so involved in this. And essentially, and it's just because I'm a philosopher and these people are, the prominent ones are also philosophers, and they're using that and using the academic prestige they have for bullshit and to promote hate. And they present this as though it is this is what serious academic work shows. Serious philosophy is anti-trans. That's a lie. And if other people, allowing people to the fact that these people are able to represent themselves as representing their discipline is something that people let them do. And I don't understand how people who have the relevant academic credentials can see this stuff and feel like they're not involved. Just in virtue of these people purporting to the public to be sharing what like the expertise of their discipline shows about this. And
Yeah, I think a lot, there are, I hate making this argument because it's an argument that gender critical people use, but I guess it's true across the board that the trans argument in public space and academia and stuff is very toxic and horrible for everyone involved. And so people just don't want to get involved. Like, you see, if you're just a cis person and you've got no trans people in your life and you're like some academic on data science and there's someone saying, oh, we need to change this question on the census that has been the same for the last 50 years for something, you could speak out and say, this is false. This, like, basically my colleague or my peer is wrong. And not just like slightly wrong, but like wrong to the point where it has to be transphobia. And then you've got to deal with the huge fallout of that. Or you could just be like, it's only trans people. And I understand that pressure. But like, I guess to anyone watching who does have any kind of academic or institutional power at all, like, just stand up for us, please. If you need support on the battlefield, if you're like, I'm going to write a tweet saying, I'm a professional and this other person is lying about trans people and you need backup, just hit me up in the DMs and I'll get a whole crew in there to start arguing on your behalf. It'll be fine.
I mean, they will yell at you, right? They function very effectively as a mob on Twitter, and they will yell at you. But they are conspiracy theorists, and their judgment of you does not track reality. And this is like, if your role and your job involves knowledge promotion and like the guise of that is being used to attack vulnerable people, what is your purpose if not to push back about it?
Yeah.
I'd say the reaction is like uncomfortable for most people, but not serious. It's just not like a serious. You're not taking a serious risk for most cis academics in pushing back against this.
Yeah, and like some of the, like pretty much every single time that a cis person does come out and support, they'll send you some really disgustingly abusive stuff. But also some of it'll be just so deranged and unhinged. It's hilarious, and it's like sometimes it's worth it. They'll say some horrible sexual thing or some racist thing or something, and then they'll write some weird analogy about race car drivers being genetic or something, and you're like, where does this come from? So just it's worth it just for that nonsense.
Yeah, you can also not read it, which I recommend strongly. When I've had back when there was more, I guess, explicit white supremacists on Twitter, like I've had white supremacists mad at me, and I did not read it because I do not care what they think about me. Like they are whackers and
they're worthless. Yeah,
like his opinions about me, like what? I know it can be like hard to not feel it if you are looking at it. Just, if I'm not looking at it, effective.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the questions, everyone. There's loads more, and I'm really sorry we don't have time to get it. We could just do like just question and answers.
We should save them for future episodes to like direct our.
See where they're going. Yeah. Yeah, okay, I'll have to go through and read them all at the end. But anyway, thank you for everyone who's asked a question. Thank you for everyone who's watched. Really appreciate everyone coming along. And yeah, if you have, like, next week we're going to be talking about like some real mad stuff, and like real mad stuff that's kind of at the core of all of what these gender critical people are saying. So it's going to get really spicy next week. So please do come along next week and let us know if there's anything we can do to improve, or like topics we're missing or anything like that. It'd be great to hear from you. Do you have anything to sign off with, or?
No, thank you guys. See you guys next week, hopefully.
Yeah. Love to everyone. See you soon.